The letter had come on a Tuesday, a fat envelope that Uncle Vernon had snatched before Harry could touch it, gone very red in the face, and then gone very quiet for 3 days. More letters had come after. Then more. They had come through every crack and vent in the house, and in the end it was Hagrid who brought the last one personally, arriving at a shack on a rock in the middle of the sea at midnight with a motorbike and a birthday cake, and the information that Harry was a wizard. That had been last night. Now it was morning, technically still his birthday, and they were in London. London was ordinary until Hagrid steered him into a small, grubby pub called the Leaky Cauldron, and then ordinary stopped. The people inside all seemed to know Hagrid. Several of them reached past him to shake Harry's hand and say things like, "An honour," and "Bless you, young man," and Harry did not know what to do with any of it. He had spent 11 years being invisible at the Dursleys, and now strangers were pressing his palm and looking at him with expressions he couldn't read. He held his face very still, the way he'd learned to, and tried to seem like he understood what was happening. Hagrid steered him through to the back of the pub and tapped a certain brick in the wall with his pink umbrella. The wall folded open. Diagon Alley stretched out in a long curve of crooked shops and brilliant windows and figures in robes of every colour, wands in a glass case, a cauldron shop with copper and pewter stacked in pyramids, owls asleep in wicker cages, and at the far end of the street, a white marble building so tall and so clean it didn't look like it belonged to the same world as the rest. That, Hagrid said, was Gringotts. The goblins inside were small and sharp, and moved with the precise efficiency of people who had decided centuries ago that unnecessary motion was beneath them. The one at the high counter nearest the door looked down at Harry over a very long nose, and said nothing. Harry said nothing either. Hagrid placed himself squarely at the counter, and announced they had 2 matters of business: Vault 687 for Mr. Harry Potter, and Vault 713 on Hogwarts business from the headmaster. He produced a letter signed by Dumbledore for the second, holding it out with the air of someone presenting a school report to a strict teacher. The goblin at the counter read the letter and passed it down the line without looking up. Eventually a goblin named Griphook came around the desk and led them to a long, low platform off the main hall, where the cart waited on its narrow track. The cart moved fast, faster than Harry had prepared for. He pressed his back against the cold metal seat and watched the stone walls blur in the torchlight, and told himself firmly he was not going to grip the side like a child. Griphook drove without speaking, staring ahead with complete disinterest. Vault 687 was deeper than Harry had imagined. The door swung open onto more gold than he had ever seen. Galleons heaped in unsteady piles, glinting in the torchlight, and Harry understood, in a lurching way, that this had been sitting here his entire life. His parents had left it for him. He didn't know what to do with that, so he filled a small leather pouch while Griphook watched and said nothing, because there was nothing yet to say. On the way back up, Hagrid said something to Griphook about the second vault, the item to be collected. Griphook said that Vault 713 required a separate journey, which was standard procedure for authorized headmaster retrievals. The cart climbed on through the tunnels. The waterfall came around a bend without warning. It was not wide, a pale curtain of falling water across the track, faintly luminous in the torchlight, and the cart went through it in a single cold second. Harry came out the other side with wet glasses and water running down the back of his neck. He was still pushing his glasses up his nose when Griphook's hand moved to a lever. The cart slowed. Then it stopped. Griphook was not looking at the tunnel ahead. He was looking at the instrument panel on the front of the cart, a cluster of dials and needles mounted in what looked like bone. and one of the needles was moving in short, rapid pulses that Harry felt quite sure were not its usual behavior. Griphook looked at Harry. The look lasted 2 or 3 seconds. It was the look of someone reading a measurement and cross-referencing it against the thing being measured. His eyes moved to Harry's forehead and stayed there. Then he reached beneath the panel and produced a narrow device that looked vaguely like a wand, but wasn't, and held it near Harry's scar. Harry sat very still. He didn't know what the device was. It emitted a faint hum near his forehead, just on the edge of hearing, and Griphook's expression gave nothing away, but his hand had gone perfectly steady in the way that sometimes meant a thing was important. Griphook stepped back. Without looking at Harry, he said, "Please wait here." He said something to Hagrid in a low voice. Another goblin appeared from further along the tunnel. Hagrid climbed out of the cart, gave Harry a wide-eyed, uncertain look over his shoulder, and followed the second goblin's cart further down into the dark. The cart went on without Hagrid. Harry sat in it. Neither he nor Griphook spoke. The side chamber was small, a bench against one wall, a sconce on the other, a low ceiling that made the room feel very enclosed. Harry sat on the bench and looked at his wet hands. His hair was still dripping. 2 goblins came in with a scroll. They spoke to each other in a language Harry didn't understand. One of them glanced at his forehead and then deliberately away. Harry noted this and filed it somewhere at the back of his mind, on the shelf where he kept everything the Dursleys had ever refused to explain. The shelf was getting quite crowded. A third goblin entered, older-seeming, with deep lines at the corners of his mouth and eyes that gave very little away. He looked at the scroll. He looked at Harry. He said in English, "There has been a routine irregularity in the detection apparatus. It will take only a moment to resolve. You are not in any trouble." "Okay," Harry said. He was not frightened. He had spent 11 years in a house where the first rule was not asking questions about things adults weren't explaining. He sat on the bench and looked at the far wall and waited. The 3 goblins moved to the far end of the chamber and spoke in voices too low to hear. They looked at the scroll. They looked at their instruments. Harry's scar was warm, not painfully warm, just present, the way it sometimes felt after a bad dream. He hadn't had any bad dreams last night. He touched the raised lightning bolt line lightly with 2 fingers, and then put his hand back in his lap and looked at the wall and waited some more. He heard Hagrid before he saw him. The unmistakable weight of those footsteps in the corridor outside. And then Hagrid was in the doorway, one enormous hand pressed flat against the frame, small black eyes taking in the bench and the goblins and Harry all at once. "What's going on?" Hagrid said. The older goblin said smoothly, "The young Mr. Potter may go. Thank you for your patience." Hagrid looked at Harry. Harry shrugged. He got up from the bench and followed Hagrid back through the corridor and across the marble main floor of the bank. Behind them, the door of the side chamber closed without a sound. Hagrid put his enormous hand briefly on Harry's shoulder as they crossed the floor. He said nothing. Harry said nothing either. The goblin had told him it was routine, and Harry had no framework for doubting that. And besides, nothing bad had happened. He had sat on a bench and been asked to wait, and now he could go. They went out through the tall bronze doors. The afternoon hit them with heat and noise, and the smell of something sweet from a bakery several shops down. The sun was at an angle that made every window blaze. Hagrid was cheerful almost immediately, steering Harry toward an ice cream parlour and checking off the remaining school list items on his fingers. Harry let himself be steered. He got a scoop of the best ice cream he had ever tasted and ate it in the warmth outside, and felt the afternoon settle back into something ordinary. He was not frightened. He didn't know yet that there was anything to be frightened of. He was 11, and this had been the best day of his life. And whatever the goblins had found in their instruments would surely turn out to be exactly what the old goblin had said: routine. Inside the bank, behind the bronze doors, a goblin was already composing a message in the formal written script reserved for institutional communications of the highest priority. It would reach every Gringotts outpost in Egypt before morning. Every curse-breaker on the roster would be recalled. Every single one. Harry Potter finished his ice cream and decided it was the best thing he had ever eaten. The antechamber had been sealed for 3,000 years, and the curse protecting it was layered 12 deep. Bill could see the first 8 layers clearly: the outer protective web, the inversion trap, the nested containment seals, and the punitive bindings underneath, each designed to activate if the previous layer was breached rather than carefully unwound. The 9th and 10th were where it got interesting. They overlapped in a way he hadn't encountered before, not stacked, but interlocked, each drawing power from the other, so that you couldn't neutralize either without working on both simultaneously, in counter-rotation. He was working alone. Fitzgerald had gone back to Cairo with heatstroke 3 days ago, and Bill had declined the offer of a replacement. He had a system. It was 6 in the morning, and the desert air was past warm and moving towards something that would be serious in an hour, and he had a strip of linen wrapped around his forehead, and his wand in his left hand, and a secondary instrument in his right, and he was running the counter-rotation at a speed that looked faster than it was. He was 20 years old and the youngest curse-breaker on the Egypt posting, and he had been doing this long enough to know that the moment you assumed a 3,000-year-old trap was something you'd seen before was the moment it had you. The goblin arrived at the top of the access shaft at 7:06. Bill heard him on the ladder. A goblin's descent is distinctive, deliberate, heavier than a human's, and kept his hands moving through the sequence. Mr. Weasley. "One moment," Bill said. He finished the counter-rotation. The 10th layer folded and went still. He checked the instrument. Stable. Set both tools down on the folded canvas at his knee. Then he looked up. Morak, the site supervisor, had not come down into the antechamber before, in 7 months. Bill noted this the way he noted unusual readings, without alarm, but with complete attention. "There's been a recall," Morak said. "All curse breakers currently stationed in Egypt, recalled to London, immediately." Bill looked at his instruments. He looked at the 10th layer, safely folded. 2 more to go, the 11th and 12th, the ones he hadn't mapped yet. The inner door of the antechamber was still sealed. He had been building toward this for 7 months. "Why?" Bill said. "Gringotts requires your expertise in a matter of immediate institutional concern." "That's all. That is all I have been told to tell you." Bill stood and began packing his tools with the same methodical care he used on the layers themselves. He asked, "Is anyone staying to hold the site?" "No," Morak said. "The site is suspended." Bill paused for a moment. He thought about the inner door. He thought about the 11 and 12 layers he hadn't mapped. Then he packed the rest of his kit and followed Morak up the ladder. The field camp held 9 people when everyone was present. Bill came back to find 6 already packing. O'Sullivan, 3 weeks from the end of a 5-month stabilization project at a different site, was sitting on his camp trunk in the shade with the look of someone doing very precise, emotional mathematics. Nobody seemed to know why the recall had come. The summaries were all identical. Recall, immediate, all personnel, no explanation. Someone suggested an incident at the bank. Someone else suggested a major find. A third person said the word war, and everyone went quiet. And then O'Sullivan said, "Don't," and they went back to packing. Bill finished his tea and packed his kit and didn't speculate. What he knew about Gringotts was that it didn't make institutional moves without reason, and didn't move quickly without very good reason. The reason would become apparent when it became apparent. The portkey deposited him in London at 4 in the afternoon. He walked out into August heat that was nothing like Egypt's, stickier, closer, and took the tube to Charing Cross and went through the leaky cauldron into Diagon Alley. The alley was busy with school-shopping families. He moved through the crowd of parents and children with their school lists and felt oddly displaced. 8 months in Egypt had made this slightly foreign, the specific texture of the British wizarding world in summer. He passed a cluster of first-year students, one girl already clutching the standard book of spells grade 1 with the expression of someone who had read it twice. He thought of Ron. Ron was going to be on that train in less than a month. Gringotts rose at the end of the alley, white in the afternoon light. The lower assembly chamber held 11 curse-breakers by the time he arrived. He recognized faces from other postings: North Africa, South America, a vault specialist from Rome. No one looked alarmed, which was either reassuring or professional habit. Bill could not tell which. The senior Goblin official who entered 15 minutes later was tall for a Goblin and moved with the economy of someone who had inhabited authority for a long time. He looked at the assembled curse-breakers, said something brief to an aide, and then looked at Bill directly. "Mr. Weasley, come with me." Bill followed him through 2 corridors, deeper into the bank, into the parts that the public never saw, and into a small room with a table and 2 chairs and no windows. The official sat. He did not offer his name. Bill sat across from him and waited. "A detection was made 11 days ago," the official said. "At this bank, during a routine vault visit, a child, a first-year student, attending Hogwarts this September." Bill said nothing. He was listening. The detection apparatus registered 2 overlapping signatures on this child. The secondary, an ancient love-working, sacrificial in origin, is documented. Unusual but known to us. A pause. The primary is not. The closest structural parallel in our institutional records is the class of bound soul magic your teams encounter in deep-level Egyptian tomb enchantments. What your documentation designates as soul fetters, dark essence bound into an object, passive, permanent, protecting something. Bill was still for a moment. Then he said, "Bound into an object. Bound into a child, into the scar on his forehead, into living tissue." Bill looked at the table. He had spent 2 years mapping the mechanics of soul bindings on ancient artifacts. The structures, the decay patterns, the ways the binding interacted with the host material over centuries. He had never considered what those mechanics looked like when the host was not stone or metal, but a person. "What exactly was detected?" he said. "In technical terms." "Something was bound into this child that should not be there," the official said. "Something dark and old and not his own. That is what the instruments recorded. That is what we need you to examine." Bill sat with this for a moment. "All right," he said. The flat above the apothecary on the east side of Diagon Alley was small and slightly damp, and exactly as he'd left it 8 months ago. Bill dropped his pack by the door, put the kettle on, and sat at the table while it boiled. He wrote a letter home, short, reassuring, telling them nothing, that he'd been recalled for a project, that he was fine, that he hoped to visit before term if he could manage it, that he was glad Ron was going to Hogwarts, and to tell him good luck from Bill. He did not write what he was actually thinking about, which was the structural question of how you bound a fragment of dark essence into a scar on a child's forehead, and what you would even look for when you sat down to examine it, and whether the binding could be safely approached at all. He did not write that Gringotts had recalled its entire Egypt operation to deal with this. He did not write that the biggest puzzle he had ever been handed might be living in a first-year student's forehead on the other side of the country. He sealed the letter and set it by the door for the morning owl. He made his tea, drank it at the window, and watched the last of the light leave Diagon Alley below. The notification had arrived 3 days ago in the formal copperplate, the Goblin Nation, reserved for communications of institutional weight. It described, in the precise, non-alarmist language goblins used for everything from account errors to catastrophe, an irregularity detected during a routine vault visit on July 31st. A first-year student, a request for a meeting at Dumbledore's earliest convenience. He had known whose vault visit it was before he'd finished the first sentence. He walked through Diagon Alley in late August. The crowd thinned from the height of the school shopping rush and did not hurry. He arrived at Gringotts' great bronze doors at exactly 10:20 and was led through a side corridor, past chambers the public never saw, into a room with a long, formal table and walls that had absorbed many centuries' worth of difficult conversation. The goblin who rose to receive him did not offer his name. He moved with the authority of someone accustomed to having the more powerful party in the room be nonetheless on the defensive. "Headmaster Dumbledore." "Thank you for seeing me," Dumbledore said. It was the correct response for a meeting he had not, technically, been given a choice about attending. The official placed a roll of documentation on the table. Not dramatically, the way one places something that speaks for itself. The figures were in the Goblin Nation's internal technical notation, partly numeric, partly script. On July 31st, the official said, the thief's downfall registered an anomaly on a passenger in Transit Cart 7. Secondary examination confirmed 2 overlapping magical signatures on the passenger's person. The first is an ancient, protective working of sacrificial origin, love magic, in the older classification. The second is of a different nature entirely. He tapped the scroll. In our terminology, the second signature is a soul fetter, a fragment of living, dark essence, bound, without the consent of the vessel, into the vessel itself. In our institutional records, soul fetters appear exclusively in the context of dark artifacts of extraordinary provenance, objects associated with the most deliberate and serious class of dark magic. In 1100 years of Gringotts documentation, we have no recorded instance of a soul fetter on a living person. The room was quiet. Dumbledore had spent 60 years learning to receive difficult information without displaying what it cost him to receive it. He spent those skills now. His face gave nothing away. His hands, folded on the table, were still. Inside, something shifted with the permanent, settling quality of ground after a tremor. He had spent 10 years thinking about Harry Potter, the prophecy, what the boy would need and when. He had thought about the scar as a mark, a record of the night the killing curse struck and rebounded, a conduit perhaps between the boy and whatever remained of Voldemort's disrupted power. He had thought about the protection Lily's death had woven into the boy's blood, about Privet Drive and the fortress that was Hogwarts. He had not, once in 10 years, asked himself what the killing curse had left behind when it rebounded. He had not thought to. "The passenger," Dumbledore said, keeping his voice entirely even, "was a child." "Harry Potter," the official said. "Age 11. We are aware of who he is." "I see." Dumbledore looked at the scroll. "What is the Goblin Nation's position?" "Our position is this." The official's hands remained still. This child entered Goblin sovereign territory, bearing a dark soul working of the most serious class. Under Goblin law, that is a security matter within our jurisdiction. We are not requesting ministry permission. The ministry has no authority over what occurs inside this building. We are notifying you as the child's institutional guardian, as a professional courtesy. We will be sending an examiner. We expect reasonable access." "I would ask for time," Dumbledore said, "until term begins. The boy has had a disrupted enough summer already." The official studied him. "Until September the 15th, he said, "a fortnight into term. No longer." He looked across the table with the unhurried assurance of someone whose institution had been managing difficult situations since before Dumbledore's grandfather was born. "The examiner we are assigning has the strongest technical record in soul-bound enchantment work currently available to us. He was recalled from our Egypt posting specifically for this purpose. His name is William Weasley." Dumbledore filed the name. The Weasley family, known to him. The eldest son. A curse-breaker and field man with direct, practical experience in precisely this category of magic. He found himself, unexpectedly, moderately reassured by the choice. "September the 15th, he said. "Thank you." He walked back through Diagon Alley more slowly than he had arrived, and thought. The killing curse could not be deflected or reflected, except under a precise condition that had never, to anyone's knowledge, occurred in practice until October 1981. Lily's death had met that condition. The curse struck Harry and rebounded onto Voldemort, and Voldemort's body was destroyed. What happened to the curse's energy when it rebounded, Dumbledore had never fully worked out. He had assumed, had believed without examining the belief, that it dispersed into the scar's formation, that the scar was the physical residue of the impact, nothing more. He had built 10 years of plans around this belief. He had been wrong. He had been wrong in the way you are wrong when you build a theory on incomplete foundations and never test it because the theory is useful and the test might be costly. Voldemort had left a fragment of himself in that child's scar. Whether the fragment could be safely examined or addressed, Dumbledore did not know. Whether addressing it was even the correct goal, the two signatures overlapping, the soul fetter and Lily's love magic layered together, he did not yet understand. He needed to understand it before the 15th. He needed to do so without the Ministry's involvement, without alarming Harry, and without revealing to anyone what he was beginning to suspect. He was, at this moment, operating with less information than the goblins had. He returned to Hogwarts through the leaky cauldron fireplace. His office was quiet in the way of very old rooms. A quiet built up over centuries, settled into the stone. The instruments on their shelves turned slowly in the afternoon light. The portraits of old headmasters pretended, with varying commitment, to be asleep. Dumbledore sat and didn't reach for anything immediately. He had found, over many decades of difficult problems, that reaching for a solution before the problem had fully arranged itself was how you arrived at the wrong answer very efficiently. He had always believed his 10 years of preparation had given him a defensible position, that the variables were known, the key players accounted for, the general shape of what was coming understood well enough to plan against. The meeting he had just come from had demonstrated that he was wrong about this in a way that was, in the truest sense of the word, fundamental. He did not know what a piece of Voldemort embedded in a living child meant. He had never, in a lifetime of study, had reason to know. He would need to learn quickly and quietly, and before anyone less careful than himself began to ask questions. He picked up a quill and wrote a short letter to Severus Snape. "Something has come up concerning the boy," he wrote. "I will explain in full when I am in a position to. In the meantime, once term begins, I would ask you to keep a watchful eye on him, more watchful than you had planned. I may have been operating on incomplete information. I am working to rectify this. Keep this between us." He sealed the letter. He placed it with the morning correspondence. He sat in the quiet for one moment longer, with the instruments turning and the portraits breathing in their frames. And then he reached for the first relevant text on the shelves and began to read. He had learned to push things into the back of his mind and leave them there. The side room in Gringotts was one such thing. He had spent August replaying it occasionally, the Goblin's narrow device held near his forehead, the faint hum, the 3 goblins at the far end of the chamber with their scroll. And each time he had reminded himself that he'd been told it was routine, and filed it away. By the time September arrived, he had filed it firmly enough that it only surfaced when he wasn't thinking about anything else. He came through the barrier at platform 9, 3 or 4, with an owl cage in one hand and a trolley that kept pulling to the left, and was immediately surrounded by families. He navigated through the noise of it on his own, and found a compartment near the back of the train, and put his trunk in, and sat by the window, and watched the platform fill. He did not look for anyone. He didn't know anyone. That was fine. The door slid open, and a red-haired boy looked in, and asked if it was all free. His name was Ron Weasley, and he had 4 older brothers somewhere on the train, and a younger sister crying on the platform because she wasn't old enough to come, which he described with the particular weariness of someone who had been witnessing this for weeks. They talked. Ron told him about the wizarding world in the easy, unsorted way of someone who'd grown up in it, and found most of it obvious, except for the specific things he found remarkable. He ate several of the sweets Harry bought from the trolley, and did not ask about the scar or Voldemort, which Harry was discovering not everyone was capable of, and which he found enormously refreshing. "My brother Bill came back from Egypt a few weeks ago," Ron said at some point, without explaining why. Mum's been desperate to know, but he won't say. Gringotts business, apparently. Harry didn't know why, either. He filed it with everything else he didn't know, and said, "What does your brother do?" "Curse breaker. He breaks curses on old tombs, Egyptian ones mostly." Ron sounded faintly proud of this. He was in the middle of something big, I think. He seemed strange about it. Not worried, just close. Wouldn't talk about it. Harry said he understood, and he did. A girl knocked and came in and introduced herself as Hermione Granger. She had already attempted the most important first-year spells, and successfully performed 2, and she had memorized enough of the syllabus to have opinions about which subjects were going to require the most preparation, and she spoke with the focused energy of someone who had been waiting a long time for somewhere to belong. She sat down and was still talking when the train began to move. Harry was not unhappy. This struck him, as the platform slid away, as something worth noticing. Hogwarts appeared across the black lake in the dark, lit from within and reflected in the water below, and Harry stared at it from the bow of a small boat and felt something in his chest that was close to the opposite of the tight feeling he'd had under the stairs at Privet Drive for as long as he could remember. The castle grew as the boats crossed, and it did not stop being extraordinary. He didn't have a name for what he felt. He filed it under good. Professor McGonagall met them in the entrance hall. A tall, imposing witch with a severe dark bun and square spectacles, whose expression made clear she had done this a great many times, and expected reasonable behavior from everyone involved. They waited. The doors to the great hall opened. The ceiling was not a ceiling. It was the night sky, wide and star-scattered above hundreds of floating candles, and Harry knew from something Hermione had said on the train that it was an enchantment, and knowing that did not make it less extraordinary. He was so busy looking at the sky that he barely registered the sorting hat until it began to sing. He registered it then. The hat sat on a stool at the front of the hall and sang a long song about the 4 houses, Their natures, their histories, the kinds of people who'd sat where Harry was standing now. And Harry stood in the line of first years, and listened, and felt the cold certainty that when his name was called, something would go wrong. He did not know what. "Potter, Harry." He sat on the stool. The hat came down over his eyes and went dark. It spoke to him, not quite in words, more like thoughts acquiring voices, rising up to meet his own. Courage, it said. A good mind. Then something changed, some shift in its attention, and Harry felt it in the scar, a warmth along the lightning bolt line of it, faint. Nothing like pain, but present. Like something inside the scar had come aware of what was happening and was paying attention. He sat very still. He had no vocabulary for what he was feeling. The hall beyond the hat's brim was a blur of candlelight and expectant faces. None of that seemed important. "Better be," the hat said quietly, only for him, and then loudly to the hall. "Gryffindor." The warmth subsided as Harry pulled the hat off and made his way to the Gryffindor table. By the time he sat down, it was gone. He filed it with the Gringotts side room and told himself it was nothing, and almost believed it. Ron was sorted into Gryffindor. Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor. A round-faced boy named Neville Longbottom, who had lost his toad twice on the train and had the general air of someone to whom the world happened more than most, was sorted into Gryffindor and sat down next to Harry with a look of such genuine relief that Harry felt an immediate warmth toward him. The feast was the best meal Harry had ever had. He ate until he was uncomfortable, and then ate a bit more, because no one here was going to tell him he didn't deserve it. He looked at the staff table while he ate, in sections, the way you look at something when you're not sure you want to be caught looking. The man with the greasy black hair and pallid complexion at the far end of the table was watching Harry. Not constantly. Not the way the people at the leaky cauldron had watched him, with the warm, helpless recognition that Harry didn't know how to receive. This was different. The man's dark eyes moved over Harry once with a quality Harry could only call assessment, like someone reading an instrument, and then he looked away. Harry found it unsettling in a way he couldn't account for, and decided not to think about it. Percy Weasley, red-haired fifth year doing his best impression of a prefect, said it was Snape. Potions. He wanted the defense job. At the other end of the table, a man in a purple turban sat fidgeting with his sleeves, not quite looking directly at anything. He was pale and slight, and ill at ease in a way that seemed constitutional rather than situational. Harry noticed him the way he noticed most things, briefly, and then moved on. He did not wonder, for longer than a moment, what was under the turban. The dormitory was warm and quiet after the noise. Harry lay in his bed and touched the scar lightly with 2 fingers. Nothing, just the raised line of it, the way it always felt. The warmth he'd felt under the hat was entirely gone. He didn't know what it had been. He decided he would not think about it until he had to, which was the same decision he'd been making about the Gringotts side room all summer, and it had worked well enough so far. He went to sleep in the first bed that had ever been entirely his own, in the first place that had ever felt, quietly and without drama, like somewhere he might actually want to stay. He had spent 2 weeks in the Gringotts archives, and he had found nothing that matched. There were records going back 1100 years, every soul fetter documented by a Gringotts examiner, every case of bound dark essence extracted from an artifact, every instance in which the Cursebreaker teams had encountered magic so old and so deliberate that it had become indistinguishable from the object it protected. He had read all of it. The closest structural parallel he'd found was a pre-dynastic burial jar from the 3rd Luxor excavation, sealed 3,000 years ago, with what the documentation called a living essence binding, a fragment of the tomb-maker's intent, compressed and fixed into the clay to act as a permanent deterrent to anyone who tried to open it. That binding had been on an object, an 11-pound clay jar which could be set down, removed, wrapped, locked away, and examined at a safe distance. The person Bill was going to examine this morning was 11 years old and in his first fortnight of school. He checked his instruments, confirmed the 2 Goblin observers were ready, and took the flue to the Hogsmeade receiving point. Hogwarts couldn't be apparated into. The grounds had wards that made even flue access a matter of negotiating with the castle's own protections. They walked the rest of the way up. Bill wore his Gringotts work clothes, dragon-hide jacket and boots, the fang earring he'd had since his 2nd year in Egypt, and his red hair was pulled back, and he carried his examination kit in a flat case under one arm. He looked, he was aware, like someone who did this sort of thing regularly. He was not sure he was. Dumbledore was waiting at the gates. Bill's first impression of Albus Dumbledore was of someone who occupied slightly more space than he filled. Tall, silver-haired, silver-bearded, with a quality of absolute attentiveness that made you feel, without any theatrics, that you were the only thing in his field of vision. He shook Bill's hand and assessed him in what appeared to be the same motion. "Mr. Weasley," he said, "I appreciate the thoroughness of your preparation. I'm told Gringotts considers you among their most precise field examiners." Bill thanked him and said he would do his best. He was professional and polite, and did not mention that he had read every piece of relevant documentation available to him and found no precedent for any of it. They walked to the castle. The boy was pulled out of Charms, first class of the morning, and arrived at the headmaster's office, slightly breathless, and stopped in the doorway taking in the room. Bill watched him take it in. The 2 goblins standing at the room's perimeter, the man in Gringotts work clothes with a flat case of instruments, Dumbledore behind his desk. The boy's face was careful. He filed the information without visibly reacting. He was small for his age, dark-haired, with hair that seemed structurally committed to disorder. Round glasses, and the scar, the lightning bolt mark on his forehead, exactly where the detection readings had pointed. In person it was unremarkable, a thin line of raised skin, slightly paler than the surrounding forehead. Nothing about it suggested what the instrument said it contained. "Harry," Dumbledore said, "thank you for coming. Please sit down." Harry Potter sat. Dumbledore explained, choosing each word with the care of someone assembling something fragile, that when Harry had visited Gringotts in July, the bank's instruments had detected something in his scar, an enchantment left over from the night Voldemort had attacked him in 1981. His mother's protective working was one layer. There appeared to be another, older layer, less well understood, which the Gringotts examiner would like to study. The process was entirely non-invasive, readings only, nothing done without Harry's consent. He said Harry's consent very specifically, and he waited. Harry looked at Dumbledore for a moment that ran a second or two longer than polite. Bill watched this without intervening. The boy's expression was not fear, not anger, not suspicion exactly. More like the look of someone tallying things they have not been told and adding the current item to the list. It was, Bill thought, an 11-year-old's version of extreme self-control. "All right," Harry said. Dumbledore stepped back. Bill arranged his instruments on the cleared desk, modified detection tools, calibrated for finer work than the thief's downfall, built for sustained contact rather than transit readings. He positioned a stool in front of the desk and nodded at it. "This won't hurt," Bill said. "I just need you to hold still." "Okay," Harry said, and sat on the stool and looked at the instruments with the frank curiosity of someone who'd decided curiosity was a safer response than worry. Bill began. The readings came in the way deep structure readings always did. Surface noise first, then the harmonics, then the underlying architecture. What had registered on the thief's downfall as two overlapping signatures was considerably more layered up close. The love magic was extraordinary, not old in the way he usually meant old, but deep, as though it had been there long enough to put down roots, as though it had become structural, and beneath it, threaded through it. He kept his hand steady and his expression neutral. In the 4th minute, Harry said, without looking up from the floor he'd been studying, "What's your name?" Bill said, "Bill Weasley." Harry looked up. "Ron's brother?" Bill looked up from the instruments. "You know Ron?" "He's in my dormitory," Harry said. Bill looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the readings and finished the last sequence. "Small world," he said quietly. He worked for 2 more minutes. He assembled his notes. Then he set the instruments down and told Harry he was done and thanked him. Harry got up from the stool, looked at the instruments once more with a brief, unreadable curiosity, and left. The door closed. The 2 goblin observers came to the desk. Dumbledore came away from the window, where he had been standing for the duration. Bill told them what he'd found. The binding was not artifact class in its mechanism. It had the same deep, fixed, passive structural signature he recognized from the tomb enchantments. That much confirmed the initial detection, but the origin was entirely different. Artifact class soul fetters were deliberate acts, a practitioner binding essence into a prepared object under controlled conditions. This one had not been deliberate. It had been introduced at the moment of a catastrophic magical collision. Specifically, at the instant a killing curse struck a sacrificial protective enchantment and rebounded. A fragment of the curse-caster's essence had embedded itself in the nearest living tissue at the moment of impact. The scar. Bill did not have a documented case for this. He did not believe one existed. "The 2 signatures are not independent," he said. "The dark binding and the protective enchantment are interlocked, structurally, not coincidentally. You cannot examine or address the soul fetter without directly engaging the love protection. I don't know what that engagement would produce." He looked at Dumbledore. "I'm not sure anyone does." Dumbledore looked at the window. His expression had not shifted in any way Bill could identify since before Bill started speaking. "No," Dumbledore said. "I don't believe anyone does." Bill closed his case. He gave Dumbledore his timeline for the formal report, 1 week, and shook hands with the goblin observers and said he would be in contact. He walked back to the gates. The September afternoon was clear, and Hogwarts sat behind him, solid and ancient and indifferent to everything it contained. He thought about Ron's letters from school. Ron had mentioned Harry Potter twice in 2 weeks, in the easy shorthand you used for someone you'd already decided was a friend. He wondered if Harry Potter, who had sat still on a stool for 9 minutes while 2 goblins watched and a cursebreaker held instruments near his scar and told him almost nothing about what they were looking for, had any idea that there was anything to find. He suspected not. He suspected that was deliberate. He walked to the gates and turned toward Hogsmeade and went back to write his report. The letter from Dumbledore arrived in October, 3 paragraphs of dense, measured prose, the kind Dumbledore wrote when he had worked out exactly what he wanted to say before writing it. Snape read it once, standing at his desk. Then he read it again. Then he set it down. A fragment of dark essence, bound passively into the scar tissue at the moment of the 1981 attack. The Gringotts examiner's findings, 2 interlocked signatures, the killing curse's remnant, threaded through Lily's sacrificial protection. Snape had spent 7 years in Voldemort's service before the body was destroyed. He had heard things in those years, in those rooms, at those meetings. He had understood by the end that Voldemort's approach to mortality was not merely reckless, but systematic, that he had taken deliberate steps, plural, to make certain he could not fully die. Snape had not known the precise nature of those steps. He had not wanted to. The knowledge felt, even then, like something corrosive. But he knew what you did to a soul if you wanted to anchor yourself beyond death. He knew the nature of the act required. He knew, in the cold and specific way that came from having been in those rooms, what Voldemort had been capable of, and what he would have been willing to do. And he knew, reading Dumbledore's careful letter, what kind of thing the Gringotts' instruments had found in Potter's scar. He went to Dumbledore's office that evening. "Did you know?" Snape said. Dumbledore looked at him across the desk with the expression of someone who had been expecting this question. "No," he said. "Not this. Not the nature of it. What did you know?" "That the scar was a conduit of some kind, that Harry bore some trace of Voldemort's power, that Lily's protection was the primary enchantment and the most urgent concern." A pause. "I knew those things. I did not know what the trace was." Snape said nothing. The quiet ran longer than was comfortable. Then, "You have had 10 years." "Yes," Dumbledore said simply. "I have." Snape looked at the instruments turning on their shelves, the portraits pretending their various sleeps. He looked at all the comfortable furnishings of a man who had been the most capable person in every room he'd entered for 60 years, and had not checked. "What are you going to do?" he said. "What I can," Dumbledore said, "as quickly as I understand it." "That's not enough." "No," Dumbledore said. "It may not be." Snape left. In his office in the dungeons, he sat without moving and let the evening pass outside his window. He was not thinking about Potter. He had spent 10 years not thinking about Potter as a discipline, because the boy's existence was a complicated and painful subject, and Snape had better uses for his attention. What he was thinking about was Lily Evans, who had died protecting her son, and whose protection had been containing something considerably worse than a conduit effect for a decade, without anyone establishing what it was containing. She had deserved better than to have her death treated as sufficient and left unexamined. She had deserved, at minimum, for someone to have looked at what she'd left behind and understood it properly. He was furious on principle, and he kept it cold, because cold was the only form of this he trusted himself with. He did not make the mistake of sentimentalizing what he felt. He was not grieving the child. He was outraged by the situation, by the decade of Dumbledore's confident half-knowledge, by the goblins being the ones to find it, by the fact that Lily's protection had been doing 2 jobs simultaneously, and no one had noticed because no one had checked. He would watch the boy more closely, not warmly. He had no capacity for warmth where Potter was concerned, and the boy had not asked for it, and warmth was not what was needed. Vigilance was what was needed. He was capable of that. October 31st arrived smelling of pumpkin and burned candle wax, and the great hall had been decorated into something magnificent and faintly ominous, which Harry thought captured the occasion reasonably well. He noticed Quirrell before the feast began. Not deliberately, just the way you noticed things at the edge of your attention. The defense professor moved through the hall toward the staff table, pale and slight and fidgeting, and when he passed within a few meters of the Gryffindor table, something happened in Harry's scar. A brief, sharp pressure, directional, specific. There and gone in under a second. Harry blinked. Ron was saying something about the enchanted ceiling. Harry rubbed the scar lightly and decided it was a headache, and went back to listening. He forgot about it almost immediately. The feast was excellent. Later, at a point during the meal that Harry would never be able to place precisely, the doors burst open and Quirrell stumbled in, hat askew, shouting that there was a troll in the dungeons, and then collapsed into a faint that Harry found, even at 11, somewhat unconvincing. In the evacuation, Ron leaned over and said, "Troll," with the expression of someone hoping for clarification, and Harry confirmed that that was what he'd heard. Hermione had not come to the feast. Harry had known this because Ron had said something unkind about her earlier in the evening, and had visibly been reconsidering it ever since. They left the evacuation route without discussing it. The troll was already in the girls' bathroom on the second floor when they arrived, which Harry thought was probably the worst luck Hermione had had in a very eventful first month of school. What happened in the bathroom over the next 4 minutes was not something Harry would ever be able to reconstruct with any coherence. He remembered the Trolls Club. He remembered a sink. He remembered Ron doing something very quick and very clever with a spell, and the specific quality of the silence after, when no one was dead, and the troll was on the floor, and all three of them were breathing too fast. Professor McGonagall opened the door, followed by Quirrell, and then, slightly behind, Snape. She looked at the troll. She looked at the three of them. Harry had the impression that she was running several different calculations simultaneously, and that all of them were producing interesting results. "Would someone like to explain?" she said. "What has happened here?" They tried. Hermione explained that she had come to deal with the troll herself, which was not true, and which was so precisely engineered to absorb the consequences of the evening that Harry looked at her with a slightly different understanding than he'd had before. She had made a decision, quickly and completely, to lie on their behalf. Points were removed from Gryffindor. Then points were given. McGonagall's expression throughout remained perfectly neutral. Snape, standing at the back of the room, said nothing and looked at Harry once with the dark assessing quality that Harry had noted at the start of term feast and filed away. The three of them walked back to Gryffindor Tower in the particular quiet of people who have just survived something together and are still working out what that means. Harry noticed Ron walk slightly closer to Hermione than before. He did not say anything about this. In his dormitory, in the dark, Harry lay and thought about the scar. The pressure before the feast. It hadn't been a headache. He knew what headaches felt like. This had been specific to the scar, directional, a spike that arrived and was gone before he'd fully registered it. And it had happened at the exact moment Quirrell walked past the Gryffindor table. He had written it off immediately because writing things off was a skill he'd had a lot of practice developing. He thought about the sorting hat, the warmth along the scar while the hat sat on his head, the sense that something inside the scar had come awake and was paying attention to something. He had filed that away too. They were in the same file now, the sorting hat warmth and the Halloween spike and the Gringotts side room, and whatever the goblins had found in their instruments that July, and the examiner with the red hair who had held instruments near his forehead and said, "Small world," and then had not told him what any of it meant. He didn't have enough to understand what he was filing. He filed it anyway. He turned over and went to sleep. The summons came on a Tuesday morning via the internal Gringotts messenger system. Not a note, but a small embossed card with the bank's seal, a time, and a chamber designation that Bill had never been directed to before. He had been submitting weekly reports since September 15th. Structured assessments of the detection readings, the structural properties of the binding, its stability. He had assumed his role was primarily technical. Write the reports, answer questions, be available for follow-up examinations. The Deep Council chamber on sub-level 4 was not where you went for technical follow-ups. He arrived 5 minutes early and stood in the corridor outside the chamber until a goblin aide opened the door without speaking and stepped aside. The chamber was longer than it was wide, lit by torches in iron brackets along the stone walls. the ceiling just low enough that Bill felt the impulse to stand straighter. A table ran its full length, heavy and dark and very old. 8 goblins sat along one side of it, their faces carrying the particular quality of institutional attentiveness, not hostile, simply focused, the way auditors look when they are there to assess rather than to judge. The senior goblin official, who had received Bill in September, sat at the table's head. There were documents on the table in front of each of the 8. Bill had not been given any. At the far end of the table, there was a single chair, positioned for one person, with no documentation in front of it. Bill sat in it. "Mr. Weasley," the senior official said, "thank you for attending. The Goblin Nation has arrived at a formal position on the matter you have been assessing on our behalf. We wish to inform you of this position before it is communicated to other concerned parties." He placed a single document on the table and let it sit. The soul fetter detected on the first-year student is, as your reports confirm, a fragment of the dark entity identified as Voldemort. He said the name the way he said everything, as a fact, requiring no particular courage to name. The Goblin Nation holds 1,100 years of institutional memory. Among the things that memory contains are 4 Goblin Wars, 3 of which occurred during periods in which dark wizards held significant power over wizarding Britain. We understand what conditions precede such conflicts. We have seen them at their origin. We have also seen what it costs a small, independent people to survive a war begun by someone else's political failures. He paused, not for effect. We understand what the word fragment means when applied to a being who took deliberate steps to prevent his own death. He folded his hands. Voldemort is not fully gone. The tether in this child's scar is evidence of that. The Goblin Nation does not consider this situation stable, and does not consider inaction an acceptable institutional response to instability of this kind. He paused. We are therefore invoking our sovereign right to take the child into the Goblin Nation's protective custody until the soul fetter's nature is fully assessed and the appropriate resolution determined. Under Goblin law, an object bearing a dark soul working of this class, detected on Goblin premises, falls within our jurisdiction. The child is the vessel in which the object is embedded. The jurisdiction applies. 8 goblins. 8 expressions of complete, patient stillness. "I see," Bill said. "We are not asking for ministry sanction. We are informing you as a professional courtesy, given your role in this assessment. The formal notification has been sent to Albus Dumbledore." A pause. "You will be asked to confirm the accuracy of your reports. Is there anything in your reports you would wish to amend?" "No," Bill said, "though I should say, for the record, the enchantment is stable as of my last examination. The child is not in immediate danger from the binding in its current state. Whether custodial transfer would benefit or harm his welfare is outside the scope of my technical brief." He did not give his personal opinion. He had not been asked for it. "Noted," the official said. "That will be all for now." 3 days later, Bill was called back. Dumbledore's formal response was read aloud in the same chamber by the same official in the same tone. The headmaster declined the transfer of custody. The child was enrolled at Hogwarts, which was itself a protected institution under multiple defensive enchantments. The welfare of Hogwarts students was the headmaster's responsibility. The Goblin Nation's concern was acknowledged and respected. Custodial transfer was not something the headmaster was in a position to authorize. The official set the letter down. The 8 goblins began to speak to each other in rapid gobbledygook. Bill understood roughly a third of it. His gobbledygook was functional rather than fluent, and what he followed was not reassuring. There were references to treaty language from the Third and Fourth Wars, and to precedents Bill didn't have the background to assess, and to a phrase he didn't recognize that the others received with something that might, in a human gathering, have been called gravity. The phrase was used twice. The second time it was used, the goblin on the far left set down his quill. Bill noted this. When a goblin stopped writing mid-session, it generally meant the item being discussed was not one for the formal record. The senior official listened to all of it with the stillness of someone who had already arrived at a position and was waiting for the room to catch up to him. Bill sat with his professional face on and thought about Ron's last letter from school, which had mentioned Harry Potter twice in 3 paragraphs in the easy, unremarkable shorthand of someone talking about their best friend, apparently entirely unaware. The weekend after, Bill went home. The Burrow in November, crowded, a little loud, the specific warmth of a house that had been lived in hard and continuously by the same large family for decades. The kitchen was at full stretch. His mother had made a roast with something on the side that smelled extraordinary, and there was a treacle tart on the windowsill cooling with the window cracked, and the table was set with the miscellaneous crockery of a household that had replaced things as they broke rather than as a set. Fred and George, both 13 and conspiratorial, were whispering over something at the dinner table that they concealed poorly and abandoned when they noticed Bill watching them. Percy, 15, and very much the prefect, had spent most of dinner with opinions about a piece of ministry legislation that he felt was inadequately drafted. It was, Bill thought, exactly as it always was, and exactly what he needed after 2 weeks of Goblin council chambers and the specific silence of a standoff in progress. Ginny found him in the garden after dinner. She was 10, red-haired, their mother's directness applied with 10 years less patience, and she had given him approximately 4 minutes of polite pretense before asking, "Why did you come back from Egypt?" "Gringotts business," Bill said. "What kind?" "The kind I can't talk about." She studied him with the look that 10-year-olds deployed when they were not satisfied and knew they were not going to win, but wanted you to understand that they had registered this. "Is it dangerous?" "Not for me." "For someone else?" Bill looked at her. She looked back. He said, "Let's go in. It's cold." She held the look for another moment, and then turned and went inside without another word, and didn't ask again for the rest of the weekend, which was its own kind of statement. His birthday went by on the 29th, 21, dinner at the Burrow on the Saturday because that was when everyone could manage it, his mother's cooking, a card from Ron with "Happy Birthday, Old Man," written in the large, slightly lopsided handwriting of someone who was not naturally a correspondent, but was making an effort. He took the train back to London on Sunday evening. He sat at his flat table in the lamplight and read Ron's latest school letter, which had arrived the previous Thursday, and which he hadn't had time to read before leaving for the Burrow. Ron wrote about Charm's homework, and Neville Longbottom's continuing struggles with a particular levitation variant, and the Quidditch season, and the specific quality of the Hogwarts castle in November, which apparently featured drafts, in a postscript, added in smaller writing as though it had been almost an afterthought. "Harry's brilliant, actually. You'd like him." Bill folded the letter and set it on the table. He thought about the council chamber. He thought about Ragnarok's patient, implacable voice reading out the formal position. He thought about the document on the table in front of a single empty chair. He thought he probably would. The scar had always been there. What was new was the behavior. November arrived, and the pain arrived with it. Not constant, not dramatic, but specific. Harry would be walking to a lesson and feel it, a brief, sharp pressure along the lightning bolt line of his forehead, directional, the way a sound is directional. He would look up, and Quirrell would be passing in the corridor ahead, or crossing the entrance hall, or seated at the far end of the staff table. The pain arrived as the professor entered range and departed as he moved away. There were no other triggers. Not stress, not cold, not proximity to any of the other professors. Only Quirrell. Harry noted this carefully, and then not at all on the surface. Underneath, the file was getting full. He mentioned it to no one. He didn't have the vocabulary for what he'd be reporting. He had no framework in which "my scar hurts near the defense teacher" became a sentence a person could say without sounding unwell. Quirrell had been increasingly pale and erratic through November, sweating at mealtimes, flinching at sounds, once stopping mid-lesson on Grindylows and staring at nothing long enough that the class went silent. Harry had watched all of this with the careful non-expression of someone who had spent 11 years learning when not to be noticed. In the space behind the turban wound around his host's head, something was thinking. It did not know what the goblins had found. It knew only that the tether, the thread connecting it to the fragment in the scar, had been disturbed. Something had examined the fragment. Something had looked at it in a way the fragment recognized as a tension. The sensation was familiar. It had spent lifetimes learning what it felt like to be watched. The stone first. Before whatever was gathering grew any closer, it pushed. On the last Tuesday of November, Quirrell was found at the third-floor corridor door. Snape had been watching since October. He arrived at the alcove just as Quirrell pressed his palm to the warded wood, his expression not furtive but driven, like a man in the grip of something he could not fully control. "Professor Quirrell." Quirrell turned. His face went through several things quickly and settled on confused apology. "Professor Snape, I thought I heard." "You heard nothing. The corridor is restricted." "Of course. I must have become turned around." He straightened the turban with both hands, the gesture involuntary, a tick. His eyes went to the door once more before he could stop them. "Let me walk you back," Snape said. He was at Dumbledore's office before the dinner hour. Dumbledore listened without interrupting, hands folded, eyes on the middle distance, the instruments turning behind him with their usual, unhurried precision. "He's moving faster than expected," Snape said. "Yes. You don't seem surprised." "I am not surprised that he is moving. I am surprised at the timing. The stone was always a target." A pause. "What I did not anticipate was the acceleration. What do you want from me? Continue watching. Do not let him know the degree of your suspicion." Dumbledore met his eyes. "And protect the third floor." Snape inclined his head. He did not ask what Dumbledore was not saying. Bill Weasley arrived 2 days later, on a Wednesday, carrying a flat document case and the prepared expression of a professional with nothing remarkable to report. The expression was a cover, as Dumbledore understood the moment he saw it. They sat with the door closed, portraits in various states of performed sleep. 3 days, Bill said. Ragnarok has set a deadline. If there's no agreement on resolution by Friday, the Goblin nation escalates to formal treaty invocation. Ministry involvement, whether you want it or not. I see. With respect, Headmaster, I don't think you do. The Goblin nation isn't making a legal argument. They are invoking an institutional right they have exercised twice in 6 centuries. They won both times. He set the document case on his knee. I'm here as a professional courtesy. My report is technically complete, but I thought you should hear this directly. Dumbledore studied him. The young man had his mother's forthright honesty, delivered without aggression. Thank you, he said. A silence passed. Can I ask you something? Bill said. What is the fragment actually doing to him? As far as we can determine, nothing yet. The protective enchantment is holding. Harry is entirely unaware. Bill nodded. Yet, he said. Dumbledore did not disagree. The Quidditch match was on a Saturday, cold and grey, the pitch swept by a wind that had been building all week. Harry took his starting position and looked at the sky and felt the combination of terror and exhilaration that had characterized every practice since October. Below him, the stands were packed, despite the cold. He could see the blocks of red and gold and green and silver without being able to make out faces. For the first 20 minutes, the match was straightforward as Quidditch went. He circled high above the play, watching for a glint of gold in the grey air, while below him the chasers wheeled and the beaters worked, and Fred and George ran an efficient campaign on the opposing team that resulted in 2 bludger contacts he heard from 50 feet above. Then his broom bucked. Not wind. Wind didn't grab the handle and try to throw you sideways. The broom shuddered and yanked hard to the left, and Harry gripped it with both hands and both legs and hung on while it went through a sequence of violent motions that were not his, that no rider would choose, that felt like a struggle with something that wanted him off. In the stands, he heard the crowd react. He heard Hermione shout something. His scar screamed, not the brief directional spike of a corridor encounter. A sustained shriek, worse than anything it had produced before. Harry looked through streaming eyes at the staff benches below and found Quirrell, the small, pale figure in the purple turban, not watching the match, just watching his broom with a fixed concentration that was visible even from height. Then Quirrell's gaze broke and the broom steadied all at once. Harry pulled himself upright, breathing hard, and got back to the job. There was still a snitch somewhere in this grey sky. He caught it 11 minutes later, in a dive he could not fully account for afterward, instinct and luck and possibly something else, and closed his fist around the gold and pulled up into the roar of the crowd. He did not celebrate for long. He was thinking about Quirrell's face. December arrived with Christmas decorations and the slow evacuation of noise from the castle as most students went home. By the Thursday before the holidays, Hogwarts had taken on the particular quality it only carried when nearly empty. Vast, old, almost companionably quiet. Harry was staying. So was Ron. They sat in the Gryffindor common room that evening, the fire high and the room theirs, and Harry said, "My scar hurts sometimes." Ron looked up from his charms essay. "Not now," Harry said. "But near certain people, more since November." He looked at the fire. "It's getting worse." Ron put his quill down. He looked at Harry with the attention he used when he thought something actually mattered. "Have you told anyone?" "No, I don't know what I'd be reporting." Ron turned a quill in his fingers, thinking. "My brother's been here twice studying your scar. That's his job. Old magic, bound into things that shouldn't still be active. He's a curse breaker." He looked at Harry. "Maybe him." Harry thought about the red-haired young man in the dragon-hide jacket who had held instruments near his forehead and said, "Small world," and then told him almost nothing about what he'd found. He thought about Dumbledore's face in the moment the examination ended, which had been careful in a way Harry had filed at the time and not opened since. "Maybe," he said. Ron went back to his essay. The fire settled. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Harry touched the scar with 2 fingers, held his hand there a moment, then let it drop and went to find his transfiguration homework. He did not think about it for the rest of the evening. He thought about it in the dark, after Ron had fallen asleep. The note arrived at breakfast on the 26th of December, slipped under his plate by a school owl that departed, before Harry noticed it had come. Dumbledore's handwriting was neat and unhurried. It said only, "When you have finished your breakfast, I wonder if you might come to my office." There is no urgency. The password is lemon drop. Harry read it twice. He looked across the table at Ron, who was eating toast and reading the back of a chocolate frog card with the concentration of someone conducting important research. The common room Christmas tree was visible through the portrait hole. Most of the castle was quiet in the deep, specific way it got when 3/4 of the students had gone home. Not empty, just uncrowded, the corridors given back to the echo of their own stonework. He folded the note and put it in his pocket. "Going somewhere?" Ron said, without looking up from the card. "Dumbledore's office." Ron looked up then. His expression asked the question without words. "I don't know," Harry said, because he didn't. The walk took longer than it should have. The staircases rearranged themselves twice, and Harry stood on a 4th-floor landing, watching a portrait of a sleeping knight, and thinking about all the things this meeting might be. He had a list. He had been keeping it since September. The side room at Gringotts, the examination in October, Quirrell at the Quidditch match, his scar orienting toward the defense professor like a compass finding north. He didn't know what the list added up to. He suspected he was about to find out. The gargoyle moved aside at Lemon Drop, and Harry climbed the spiral staircase and knocked. "Come in, Harry." The office was the same as in October. Instruments turning on their shelves, portraits in various states of feigned sleep, the peculiar quality of a room that had absorbed decades of careful thought. Dumbledore was standing behind his desk, and he did not look like a man about to say nothing important. He looked like a man who had decided something and was ready to say it. "Sit down," Dumbledore said. "I'll make tea." He made tea with the deliberateness of someone arranging words in the correct order. Harry sat in the chair across the desk and waited, which was a thing he was good at. "I owe you some truth, Harry." Dumbledore set a cup in front of him and sat. "You are owed more than I have given you, and I am not ready to give you all of it. But some of it I can give you now." Harry picked up his cup. He held it without drinking. "In July," Dumbledore said, "when you visited Gringotts to collect your school things, the bank's instruments detected something in your scar. Something besides your mother's protective magic, which you have carried since you were 15 months old." He paused. "I told you in October that there was a second enchantment, that the examiner was there to study it. What I didn't tell you then was what it is." He set his own cup down and folded his hands. "On the night Voldemort attacked your family, when the killing curse rebounded off the protection your mother's death had left in you, something of Voldemort came apart. His body was destroyed. But a piece of him did not dissipate with it. A fragment of his essence, of whatever he was at the moment the curse failed, was bound into the nearest living thing in the room." He looked at Harry steadily. "Into your scar." Harry was very still. "You are carrying, in the scar, a remnant of Voldemort's power, a fragment of what he was." Dumbledore's voice was even, his eyes on Harry's. "I do not have a complete name for what it is. In 10 years of study, I have not found a recorded precedent for something created this way, accidentally, at the collision of a killing curse and a love magic that should not have been able to stop it. I understand it imperfectly, and I am telling you so because imperfect understanding, stated plainly, is more honest than confident language that covers what I do not know." The instruments turned on their shelves with small sounds, the whirring and ticking of things measuring things. A portrait of an old headmistress snored gently. The fire crackled once. Harry looked at the cup in his hands. "Is it dangerous to me?" he said. "I don't believe so. In itself. The protection your mother left is holding. The two are interlocked, and the fragment is passive. As far as we can tell, it is not causing you harm." Harry nodded once. "Can it come out?" Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. I don't know yet. That is what we are working to understand. A pause. Then, does Voldemort know it's there? No, I believe not. Dumbledore held his gaze. The fragment is a piece of what he was, not a means by which he perceives or acts. He does not know. Harry sat with this. Outside the tall windows, the grounds were white with snow, the lake a grey mirror under an overcast sky. Okay, Harry said. Dumbledore waited. His waiting had the quality of someone prepared for questions, for distress, for whatever an 11-year-old might produce when told that the man who murdered his parents had left a piece of himself in his forehead. Harry put the cup down carefully on the saucer. I'd like to go now, he said. If that's all right. Of course, Dumbledore said. Harry went. He did not go back to Gryffindor Tower. He went instead to a window seat on the 3rd floor, one of the deep stone embrasures, wide enough to sit in properly, where the cold came through the glass in a faint, steady pressure against his left side. He sat with his knees up and his back against the stone, and looked out at the grounds. The snow was thick on the sloped lawns below. Nothing moved in it. Somewhere far down toward the tree line, there was the shape of the groundskeeper's hut, smoke rising from its chimney in a thin, steady column. He sat for a long time. He did not cry. He considered it and decided it wasn't what was needed. He thought instead. He thought about what it meant that the scar was not just a scar, that the thing he had carried as long as he could remember, the mark that made strangers recognize him and reach for his hand in pubs, was also carrying something else. Something left behind. Something that had not dissipated because the magic that stopped it had been too strong. He thought about his mother. He had very little to think with. A photograph from Hagrid, a young woman waving, dark-haired, green eyes that were his eyes. He had not been old enough to remember her voice. He had a handful of second-hand facts and a grave he had never visited. But she had done something, in the moment she died, that had been strong enough to stop a killing curse, strong enough to hold a piece of Voldemort in place for 10 years. Whatever she had been capable of that. He decided she had probably been extraordinary. The smoke from the groundskeeper's chimney rose steadily into the white sky. She had done this for him, specifically. She had known what she was doing and done it anyway, and it was still working now. He didn't know what to do with that, but it was worth something. It was, he thought, the most anyone had ever done for him. And he had been carrying the result of it in his forehead since before he could walk. After a while he got cold and went back to the common room. Ron was still at the table with his chocolate frog cards. He looked up when Harry came in. "All right?" he said. "Yeah," Harry said. "Fine." Ron looked at him for a moment, with the attention that meant he was deciding whether to push. He decided not to, which was one of the things Harry liked about him. "Want to play chess?" Ron said. "Yeah," Harry said. "All right." In the headmaster's office, Dumbledore sat alone for a long time after the boy left. He had spent 10 years building a plan around an incomplete understanding of what Harry was. He had known about the protection. He had built his plans around the prophecy and around Harry's role in it, and he had believed those plans were sound. He did not know whether removing the soul fragment was possible without killing Harry in the process. He did not know whether removing it was even the correct goal, whether the interlocking of fragment and love protection meant that any attempt at separation would destroy the thing it sought to protect. He did not know, and had not known for months. He thought about Harry's face when he had said, "Okay," the stillness of it. a child receiving catastrophic news with a gravity that had nothing of childhood in it, and Dumbledore recognized it because he had put it there, had arranged over years for exactly this kind of composed fortitude, and had never asked whether it was fair to require it. He thought, what does it cost an 11-year-old to be that still? He picked up his cup, found it cold, and did not drink it. Outside the windows, snow fell on the grounds, and the lake and the edges of the forbidden forest, and the castle sat in the early winter dark, old and patient, and full of things that did not yet know what they were becoming. The formal escalation was scheduled for the 14th. Bill knew the date the way he knew his own birthday. It had been sitting in the back of his mind since November, a fixed point around which everything else was arranged. He had spent January reading Ron's letters from school, which arrived on Wednesdays with the Hogwarts post, and were full of Quidditch scores and charms mishaps and references to Harry in the easy, possessive shorthand of someone who had claimed a best friend and was still getting used to having one. He thought about the 3 times he had stood in the same room as Harry Potter. The first in Dumbledore's office, in October, when the boy had sat on a stool and held still for 9 minutes while Bill ran instruments near his forehead and told him almost nothing. The second in the Gringotts Council chamber, read third hand through the official's formal summary. The third, and this was the one he kept returning to, a corridor encounter in November, brief and incidental, when Harry had passed him near the Charms corridor on Bill's way in, and had said, "Hello, Mr. Weasley," with the small, careful courtesy of a child who had learned early that being polite cost nothing, and omitting it sometimes cost a great deal. He knew the boy was stable. His instruments confirmed it monthly. He knew the enchantment was holding, and the fragment was passive, and there was no immediate danger. He also knew what Goblin custody looked like in practice. He had seen it in the archive records. 2 cases in the last 6 centuries, both artifact-bound, both resolved through the Goblin nation's internal processes across timelines that measured in years. Harry Potter was not a cursed artifact. He was 11 years old and currently learning to play wizard's chess and writing his mother monthly updates about transfiguration. Bill requested a private meeting for the 12th. He was granted 20 minutes. He went in without notes. The senior Goblin official sat at the long table in the deep council chamber without any other goblins present, which was either a courtesy or a deliberate signal that this conversation would not be formally recorded. Bill sat across from him and did not try to read which. "You have asked for time before the escalation," the official said. "You have it. 20 minutes. Bill had decided on the walk down not to work up to this. "I am proposing an alternative arrangement," he said. "I will continue the examination work indefinitely. Monthly reports to the Goblin Nation on the status and stability of the binding, structure, any changes in the fragment's activity, any destabilization of the interlocked enchantment." He kept his voice level, his hand still on the table. "I will also serve as a reporting resource for the Goblin Nation on any development relevant to Voldemort's potential return, any political intelligence within the British wizarding sphere that is relevant to the nation's institutional interests." The official was quiet. "In exchange," Bill said, "the Goblin Nation tables its demand for custodial transfer. The child stays at Hogwarts." Silence. The torches in the council chamber burned steadily. The official's expression did not change in any way Bill could identify. He had the stillness of someone who had conducted negotiations in this room for a very long time, and had learned that silence cost nothing. "You are offering us," the official said finally, "the intelligence that custody would have provided, through a mechanism that does not require us to declare open political conflict with the British ministry. That's one way to put it. The official looked at him. Why? Bill had thought about this. He had thought about it since November, since the conversation in December when he had told Dumbledore the deadline, since the moment he had sat in his flat in the lamplight, reading Ron's letter about a boy who apparently would have liked him. Because he's 11, Bill said. The official held his gaze for a long time. Long enough that Bill stopped waiting for a response and simply sat there, which was what the silence required. Provisionally accepted, the official said. 6-month review. Bill walked out of Gringotts into the January cold. Diagon Alley in January was quiet. A few witches and wizards moving quickly between errands, the shop fronts mostly lit but unhurried, the cobblestones wet with the remains of morning frost. Bill walked through it without seeing much of it. He had just volunteered himself, without authorization from Gringotts, and without any communication to Dumbledore, as an ongoing intelligence asset for a sovereign Goblin institution. He had committed himself to reporting on the British wizarding political situation to a nation whose legal independence from the ministry was the entire foundation of their power. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and that he had crossed deliberately, with full understanding of what it cost. He thought. Someone had to. It was not a comfortable thought. It was not meant to be. It was simply the thought that had been sitting underneath all the other thoughts since October, and he had finally said it out loud by acting on it. He turned up his collar and walked to the leaky cauldron, and went home. A week into term, Bill arrived at Hogwarts for the January check. Harry submitted to the examination in the small room off Dumbledore's office, without complaint and without conversation, until it was finished. He sat on the same stool he had sat on in October, and held still for the same 9 minutes, and watched the same instruments do the same work. And when Bill set them down and began assembling his notes, Harry said, "Is it getting worse?" "No," Bill said. "Stable." Harry nodded once. "Good." Bill closed the case. Harry was getting up from the stool when he stopped and said, without particular inflection, "Thank you for coming back." "It's my job," Bill said. Harry looked at him. It was the look of someone who was deciding whether to say something and then deciding to say it. "It stopped being your job a while ago, didn't it?" It was not quite a question. Bill did not have a ready answer for it. He thought about the Gringotts council chamber and the conversation that had not been formally recorded and the provisional 6-month review. "Stable," he said. "I'll be back next month." Harry almost smiled. Not quite. The expression not finishing all the way. But enough. And went back to wherever he was supposed to be. Bill was in the entrance hall pulling on his jacket when Ron appeared. He was coming down the main staircase 2 steps at a time, with his robes slightly askew and his school bag over one shoulder, and he stopped on the last step when he saw Bill, and his face did the thing it always did when he was surprised. Every thought he was having appeared on it in sequence. "Bill, what are you doing here?" "Work." Ron came down the last step. "You didn't say you were coming." "It was a professional visit. I don't always announce them." Bill straightened his jacket. "How's school?" "Fine. Chess club got a new board." Ron's gaze had moved past him, and found Harry, who had appeared at the foot of the east corridor at the wrong moment to avoid being part of this. "You know Harry?" "We've met," Bill said. "How long have you two been—" Ron looked between them with the particular expression of a youngest child who has grown up being the last to know things and has developed a sensitivity to the pattern. "Months?" "About 4, Harry said. "No one tells me anything," Ron said. Bill ruffled his hair. Ron ducked away from it and said, "Get off. with the intensity of someone who had been having this done to them their whole life and found it consistently undignified, which was what brothers were for. "I'll write when I'm back in London," Bill said. "Do your homework." "I do my homework," Ron said, which was approximately true. Bill raised an eyebrow. Ron relented. "Most of it." Bill looked at Harry, who was watching this exchange with the expression of someone encountering a thing he'd heard described, but never quite seen up close. "Stable?" Bill said. "I know," Harry said. Bill went out into the January afternoon and down the long path toward the gates and thought about the 6-month review and the monthly reports and the line he had crossed and could not cross back over, and found that he still didn't regret it. Harry's scar was hurting before they reached the 3rd-floor corridor. Not the brief directional spike of an accidental corridor encounter. Something sustained, low-grade, a pressure that had been building since dinner and was not going away. He had stopped mentioning the scar to Ron and Hermione weeks ago because there was nothing new to say. It ached when Quirrell was near, it ached less otherwise. The pattern had been established and documented and reported to Bill, and he was waiting. But this was different. This felt like a direction. The corridor was unlocked, which was the only confirmation they needed. "He's already here," Harry said. They went through the door. What followed was not heroic in the way Harry had once imagined heroism, in the vague and untested way children imagine things that have not happened to them yet. Devil's Snare was dark and grabbing, and Hermione's quick thinking got them through it. The flying keys were a problem that turned out to have a solution. Once Harry was in the air on a broomstick with the stone ache driving through his forehead and his eyes on the silver lock of the right door. The key's wing was slightly bent. He drove the broomstick at it and caught it on the first pass. The chessboard required a game they had to win. They took the places the board demanded. Harry as bishop, Hermione as castle, Ron as knight. And then Ron took over, and the game stopped being something Harry could follow. Ron played it the way he played everything, with a directness that looked simple and was not, seeing 5 moves ahead while appearing to look at 1. He moved pieces with the calm deliberateness of someone who had grown up with chess sets that talked back and had learned to think faster than the commentary. They advanced. The life-sized white pieces on the other side moved in response with a cold, grinding inevitability, and the board was scored with the marks of previous games. Harry watched Ron's face, and the face told him nothing useful about whether they were winning, because Ron's face was the face of someone doing something difficult and managing not to show it. "We can win," Ron said, once, not looking at anyone. "But I need to make a sacrifice." He moved himself. The White Queen moved. The strike was efficient and absolute, the way pieces moved on this board, and Ron went down with it and lay still among the wreckage of the square. "I'm fine," he said, from the floor. Not very convincingly. He was not unconscious. His voice was careful and steady. "Go. Hermione. You go back and send for help. Harry. Go. Ron. The board will let you through now. Go." Hermione knelt for one moment beside Ron, and then stood and looked at Harry with the expression she used when she had made a decision and was implementing it. "I'll send an owl. I'll get someone." She looked at Ron once more. "He's right. Go." Harry went. The corridor beyond the chess chamber was narrow and cold and smelled of something he couldn't name. Old stone, old magic, old dark. The scar was not the directional ache of a corridor encounter. It was the sustained scream of the Quidditch match, and it was getting worse with every step. The logic puzzle stood between the 7th room and the final door. 7 bottles in a line, most of them poison. The clue was in verse. Harry read it twice, working his jaw, and then picked up the smallest bottle, which was the one the verse pointed to, and drank it. The cold spread through his chest immediately. the particular cold of a potion with a purpose, and the door opened, and he went through. The Mirror of Erised stood at the far end of a high-ceilinged chamber that was lit by nothing obvious, just a sourceless, cold luminescence that made the mirror's gold frame seem warm by comparison. Harry walked toward it, his feet loud on the stone, and looked into it. He saw himself. Just himself. But his pockets were heavy, and in the reflection his right hand rose and opened, and there was a small, rough-cut red stone in it, brilliant against his palm. He felt the weight of it appear in his actual pocket. He turned. Quirrell was standing behind him. He did not look like himself, or rather he looked like what he had always looked like, but without the performance of looking like anything. The pale face was still pale. The slight build was still slight. What was gone was the flinching, the nervous fidgeting, the apologetic hunch of a man too anxious for his own office. What stood behind Harry now was the same body, differently inhabited. "You have the stone," Quirrell said. "I've noticed," Harry said. Quirrell's mouth curved. "Give it to me." "No." The pause that followed was short. Then Quirrell said, "I'm afraid I must insist," and reached for Harry's arm, and Harry felt two things at once. The blister heat of Quirrell's skin on his wrist, burning, the protection that his mother had left turning Quirrell's touch into damage. And something else. Something underneath it. The fragment in his scar knew this. Not the pain. Not the heat. Something that went down below sensation to something older and more specific. Recognition. The thing in his scar knew the thing in Quirrell's head the way a compass finds north. It strained. He felt it as a pull, a doubling inside his forehead, a pressure behind his eyes that was not pain, but was worse than pain, because he could feel it wanting, could feel the fragment orienting toward its source, the way it had oriented toward Quirrell in every corridor all autumn, except this was not an accident of proximity. This was the source. He held very still. He did not know exactly what he was doing. He thought, in the fractured, unsequential way you think during things that are happening too fast to properly think about, of the examination chair in Dumbledore's office in October, and the stool in the same office last September, and Bill's careful hands holding instruments near his forehead, and finding the fragment there, passive, held in place. He thought about Dumbledore's voice saying, "The protective enchantment is holding." He thought about his mother, who had done something in the moment she died that was still holding 10 years later. He refused. He did not know exactly what he refused, or how. He just held the stone in his right hand and didn't let go of it, and did not let go of himself, and Quirrell burned wherever he touched him, and the fragment strained toward its source with everything it had, and Harry stood very still in the center of all of it and thought, no, just that. No. He had no other word for what he was doing, and did not need one. Quirrell screamed. His body was going to pieces around the thing inhabiting it, crumbling at the contact points, the hands that had tried to hold Harry's arm turning to ash at the edges, the pale face collapsing inward. And from the back of his head, as the turban fell away, another face turned toward Harry. And it was the face that had been there all year, behind all of it, behind every spike of scar pain, and every corridor encounter, and every moment in the summer of 1991, when Harry had stood in a side chamber in Gringotts, and not known yet what had been found. "We will meet again," it said, "when you are older, and I am more." Then it came apart, and came through him, and the world did too. Severus Snape reached the mirror chamber 4 minutes and 20 seconds after the wards on the corridor behind Fluffy's door went active. He had been watching the third-floor corridor since November. He had known, when the wards triggered, that it was not a false alarm. He went through the chambers at speed, past the devil's snare still moving, past the key chamber, past the chessboard where a 12-year-old Weasley was sitting up against the wall being tended to by a house elf. Snape had sent ahead with a word to Dumbledore. He did not stop. The final door opened at his spell, and he went through. The mirror was still and silent. Quirrell's robes were on the floor, collapsed and ash-dusted, the shape of them already softening at the edges. Harry Potter was lying on the stone floor 5 feet from the mirror, with the stone clutched in his right hand and his eyes closed. Snape knelt, checked the pulse. Steady, too fast, but present. Checked the scar. No bleeding, no visible change, the lightning bolt mark unchanged, which meant either nothing catastrophic had happened to the enchantment, or something too catastrophic to read from the surface had. He picked the boy up without ceremony. Harry was small and weighed almost nothing. He carried him out through the door and through the corridor, and did not speak to him until they were up through the trap door and back into the torchlit normality of the school above, and even then all he said was, "You're all right," because the boy was stirring, and needed to know that before he needed to know anything else. Harry's hand, still gripping the stone, did not loosen. He woke to white. White ceiling, white curtains, the particular smell of a room designed for healing, clean linen, something faintly medicinal, the distant sound of a castle going about its business beyond the ward's closed doors. Harry lay still for a moment and took inventory. He was in a bed. He was not in pain. His right hand was closed around something small and hard. The stone. He opened his fingers and looked at it. It was exactly as it had appeared in the mirror, rough cut, brilliant red, sitting in his palm like an ordinary thing. He closed his hand again. "You're awake," said Dumbledore from a chair beside the bed. "Is Ron okay?" Harry said. "He is. He has a concussion and will be very proud of himself, justifiably, for the next several weeks." "Hermione?" "Perfectly well. She is very annoyed that she was not permitted to come with you further. You can tell her she was right about that later." Harry looked at the ceiling. "The stone?" "Is being destroyed." Dumbledore's voice was even. "Nicholas Flamel has agreed to it. He is 665 years old and has had, by most measures, enough time." Harry thought about that. 665 years. He tried to imagine it, and could not. "The thing in the scar," he said. "Is it still there?" A pause, brief, barely a pause at all. "Yes." Harry had been expecting that. The wraith had passed through him, and the scar had screamed, and then he had lost consciousness, but the fragment had not gone with it. He had felt that, in the last moment before he blacked out. Something that had strained toward its source and not followed it. "So Voldemort isn't gone," he said. "His wraith has been driven out, expelled from his host. He has no body and no anchor now, except the one he does not know about." Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. "But you held it, Harry. Whatever happened in that chamber, you held it." Harry thought about holding it. The pull, the doubling behind his eyes, the fragment orienting toward the face behind the unraveling turban, with something that had felt more like desire than pain, and him standing in the middle of it thinking, or just that word, just the refusal, his mother's protection around him, and Bill's careful instruments in his mind, and Ron's voice saying, "Go." "I didn't feel very in control of it," he said. "Control rarely feels like control," Dumbledore said. "That's how you know it was real." Harry turned the stone over in his hand once more and held it out. Dumbledore took it, wrapped it without ceremony in a handkerchief, and put it in his pocket. "Rest," he said. You have 2 days before your friends will be allowed to descend on you, and you should use them." Bill arrived the next morning. He came in with 2 goblin observers who stationed themselves near the door and did not speak, and he sat in the chair beside Harry's bed that Dumbledore had occupied the previous day, and set his instrument case on the floor, and looked at Harry with an expression that was professional, and not quite only professional. "I heard," Bill said. "I'm fine," Harry said. "I'm going to run the standard assessment anyway." "I know." The instruments told the same story the instruments always told, now that Harry had enough months of this to understand the shape of the findings, even when they weren't explained to him. The soul fetter was present, the protective charm was intact, the 2 interlocked signatures were unchanged, the fragment had not followed the wraith. Whatever had strained toward Voldemort in that chamber had stayed. Bill made notes. He wrote the Goblin report sitting in the chair at Harry's bedside, the scratching of quill on parchment, steady and unhurried, while Harry lay looking at the ceiling and not asking the question he was thinking about. Madame Pomfrey brought them both tea and seemed to feel that Bill's presence was unremarkable, which perhaps it had become. "Will it always be this way?" Harry said, eventually. Bill set the quill down. "I don't know," he said. "I will tell you honestly when I do." Harry thought that was probably the most useful thing anyone had said to him this year, and went back to looking at the ceiling. The meeting with the senior Goblin official was brief and private, and not the kind of thing Bill would later speak about in detail. He reported what had happened. The wraith expelled, the fragment unchanged, the child alive. The official was silent for longer than felt comfortable. "Did the child hold?" he said. "Yes." "Without training, without being told what he was holding?" "Yes." Another silence. The torchlight in the council chamber was the same as it always was. The official's expression was the same as it always was. That quality of patient, institutional attention that never gave away what the institution had decided until it had decided it. "6-month review extended," he said. "Continue the arrangement." "Thank you," Bill said. "Don't thank me. The situation is the same as before. We simply know now that the child can be relied upon." Bill walked out into the evening and thought, yes, that's the thing about him, isn't it? The year ended, the way years at Hogwarts ended. Ceremony and house points, and the Great Hall transformed, and Gryffindor winning the House Cup with a collection of last-minute additions that Professor McGonagall announced, with the composed satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for the numbers to come in. Harry sat between Ron and Hermione, and ate more than he needed to, and did not think very much about anything, which felt, after the year he had had, like an extraordinary luxury. The 3 of them sat in a corridor on the last night, while the castle settled into the particular quiet of a place about to be vacated. It was not the empty holiday quiet of December. It was the end-of-year quiet, different in quality. The noise not gone, but condensed, most of the school in its dormitories, the common rooms winding down. "You should write to Bill this summer," Ron said. Harry looked at him. "He's coming every month for the examinations." "That's not what I meant." Harry was quiet for a moment. He thought about January and the brief, careful exchange in the hospital wing. "Stable, I'll be back next month." And the chess report written at his bedside. And the answer I will tell you honestly when I do. He thought about the examination in October, 8 months ago now, when a 20-year-old in a dragon-hide jacket had held instruments near his scar and said small world and told him almost nothing, and had then spent 8 months telling him slightly more than almost nothing, which added up to more than Harry had expected. "I know," Harry said. "I will," Hermione said. Both of you, please don't make me watch you be terrible at expressing emotions." And they argued about that until the corridors got cold and they went to bed. The Hogwarts Express left on a bright June morning. The platform at Hogsmeade, crowded and loud and smelling of steam and trunks, owls protesting, someone's cat loose on the tracks. Harry heaved his trunk into a compartment and wedged Hedwig's cage beside it, and sat by the window as the castle fell away behind them, and Scotland gave way to England, and England gave way to the outskirts of London, and he thought about the summer. The Dursleys would be at the other end. Privet Drive, the small bedroom and the thin mattress, and the particular quality of a house in which he was permanently outnumbered. He did not pretend otherwise to himself. He had learned a long time ago that pretending things were different from what they were did not make them different. But the summer was also this: Ron's address in his trunk, Hermione's address in his trunk, and a monthly appointment that Bill would keep whether or not Harry wrote to him, and the knowledge, partial, imperfect, honestly stated, of what lived in his scar, and what it had done when it mattered. He had held it. He didn't know how. He had done it anyway. The train pulled into King's Cross, and the noise of the return descended. Trolleys, voices, families finding each other in the crowd. Harry walked through the barrier from platform 9 3/4 with his trunk and his owl, and came out onto the Muggle side, where the Dursleys were waiting with the expressions they kept specifically for collecting Harry from places he had enjoyed being. He walked toward them. The crowd shifted and parted and moved around him. On the concourse behind him, a maintenance door opened and closed without any Muggle noticing it open. A compact figure in unremarkable clothing took up a position near the corner of the east exit, where the exits to the street were visible and the crowd could be watched in both directions. Still, patient. A goblin observer with 1,100 years of institutional memory standing behind him, watching a boy walk